Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be, once again, revisiting the case of Sarah Boone, as she has sent a 28-page letter to Judge Michael Kranick, who recently sentenced her to life in prison. While we fully expected to move on from this case since it came to an end, Sarah keeps doing frankly ridiculous things, and we are completionists. I promise there are more cases coming, and there will be longer breaks in between Sarah videos. But alas, we received quite a number of emails and comments requesting that we review the 28-page letter. So if this is somehow your first time on the channel and you have no idea who Sarah Boone is, you have unfortunately clicked on the wrong video. I'll leave a playlist in the description box with all of our coverage into Sarah, which is likely over 10 hours long, but I will do my best to summarize. This video is sponsored by Aura. Chances are reasonably high that if you have ever bought something online, or used social media, or done anything on the internet, you have received one of these nifty emails telling you that your personal, private information was shared in a data breach. Yahoo, Capital One, Equifax, Facebook, Adobe, and even more massive, powerful companies that you have shared your personal, private information with have all been compromised across the years by hackers who could use your private data to do almost anything. The first time I ever got one of these emails, I thought nothing of it. The notice said my information was part of a data breach, one that affected close to 1 billion people. With that in mind, I figured so many people would be affected by the information that mine would be lost in the pile. I had nothing to my name and stopped thinking about it the moment I closed the email, but then people started using my personal information to open fraudulent credit cards, which would destroy my credit. It took years to right all the damage that was done, and to this day, I still worry about my personal information being used in that way. And that's why anytime I find a service that makes protecting my personal, private information just a little bit easier, I use it, which is exactly what Aura is. Aura is a company that protects you and your data online, no matter what your exact needs are. They'll remove your personal information from data brokers and people search sites, making it harder for your identity to be stolen. They monitor your personal data, including your social security number, and offer $1 million identity theft insurance, and losses are free should your data be compromised. They alert users when it appears that some unsavory party is trying to open fraudulent lines of credit in their name, and provides you with the ability to lock your Experian file with just a tap. Not to mention that they also provide VPN protection, antivirus, password managers, and so much more. Prior to using Aura, I'd have to go to each site manually where my data was available, manually opt out, and monitor the site to make sure that the information was taken down. I would spend hours of my time verifying information, going over my records, and poring over articles to see if my information was somehow compromised. But Aura makes it so much easier. I cannot recommend Aura enough. And if you're anything like me, then you'll definitely want to try them out. So stop leaving yourself open to data breaches and brokers, and take control of your information by going to aura.com/dreading to get 2 weeks for free. I want to thank Aura for sponsoring this channel and also for making my life so much easier. So with all of that said, let's get into the video. Sarah is a delusional alcoholic and a narcissist who fundamentally believes she is not responsible for her actions. Because she has such a high viewpoint of herself, she cannot comprehend her own negative qualities, even though they are much more present in her daily life than her positive ones. She describes herself as a loving mother, partner, and a high achiever, even though all of her achievements happened in high school, decades ago, and she was divorced by her ex-husband after endangering their son countless times with her drinking. She had been witnessed by her neighbors and family members drinking herself into a stupor when her son was in her custody, and on at least one occasion, he was able to leave her apartment on his own to wander around aimlessly because she had passed out drunk. It was only for the kindness of strangers that he was kept safe, and her ex-husband would state that even though they were no longer together, he would still have to be on call. Sarah would call him every day, multiple times a day, and scold him for things, like not waking her up to pick up their son from school when it was her turn for custody, or not coming to fix an appliance, and more. But because of Sarah's inability to process her own faults, she refused to acknowledge any of that information. All of that either didn't happen, or is being wildly misconstrued in order to make her seem like a bad person, which she is adamant that she is not. She claimed in court that it was Brian who refused to stop talking to Sarah, that he was constantly badgering her to do things, and stuff, and that the marriage had broken down due to differences in parenting styles, which is somewhat true if you think about it. Brian didn't think it was an appropriate parenting technique when Sarah would leave their child unattended to go drink in the middle of the day while he was at work, and she did. So I guess that one thing is accurate. Moreover, this isn't a narrative being spun about Sarah by her bitter ex, who seeks to bury her in the media, or win a court case against her. If anything, Brian Boone's repeated interviews with police and his responses to Sarah in the lead up to the trial have all shown an incredibly passive man who just wanted his son to have a relationship with his mother. All of his stories have been confirmed through direct evidence, as well as witness statements and even Sarah's own neighbors confirming his assertions. Meanwhile, the only person who seems to agree with Sarah's version of events is Sarah herself, and she has gone on record to state that she does not believe she even really has a drinking problem. However, the public was not made aware of Sarah's antics because of her divorce and her subsequent treatment of her son and ex-husband. Instead, the world at large learned of Miss Boone because she murdered her boyfriend, George Torres, by locking him in a suitcase, supposedly during a game of hide-and-seek, and then took a mocking video of him as he begged for air. Then, of course, either threw the suitcase down her apartment stairs and then potentially beat it with a bat, then left him in the bag overnight where he suffocated to death. The details of the crime itself were strange, because someone being murdered via suitcase is eye-catching and demands explanation. But Sarah's strange behavior that was showcased on the police body cam footage only gained more public attention. But again, Sarah couldn't even admit to having an issue with alcohol, which unfortunately had caused her divorce, and most of the turmoil in her life. So even when she was met with direct evidence of what she did via video that she took of George dying, she refused to acknowledge it. According to Sarah, not only is it inconceivable that she would ever be responsible for someone else's death, it's insulting that people would believe that she's stupid enough to leave so much evidence. She sees herself as a smart, kind, and courteous person, someone who people generally look up to and respect. She is the mother every woman strives to be, and the wife any man would be lucky to have, and so on. If she was going to commit a cold-blooded murder, she's of the belief that she would get away with the crime expertly, which is a common belief shared by narcissists that we have covered on the channel. Mark Twitchell, Robert Tellis, and Ali Abulaban were all genuinely shocked and offended by the court cases against them, because even though they had left such obvious and damning direct evidence leading to their capture, they felt that they were too smart to have done so. All of them argued that, like Sarah, they were being framed or set up by the justice system, even though their crimes obviously could not have been done by anyone else. In the nearly 5-year lead up to the trial, Sarah has written letters stating that she was being wrongfully imprisoned for crimes she didn't commit, and that she would be exposing the justice system for its rampant corruption during the course of her trial. But, as you might have seen in our previous coverage, that is not what happened. She was able to maintain her composure on the stand, but unfortunately was never able to conclusively show any examples of police wrongdoing in the investigation into her. Her entire defense was based on the fact that the relationship with George was abusive, and that she had left him in the case in order to protect herself from his violence, even though his death was unintentional. Again, a full breakdown of her defense will be left in the description box down below. Needless to say, she was unsuccessful. The video of her mocking George as he begged for his life was too much to overlook or try to explain away for most of the viewing public, and the jury quickly determined that she was guilty of second-degree murder. It's also important to state that prior to the trial, Sarah had been offered a plea deal. The state was willing to lower the charge against Sarah to voluntary manslaughter, which would have resulted in her spending about 13 years in prison, but she rejected the offer outright. She believed in her case and thought she was going to walk out of trial a free woman. It also seemed that she believed, somewhat, that if she lost the trial, that offer would still be on the table. That 13 years in prison would be the worst-case scenario, but after being found guilty of second-degree murder, she was sentenced to life in prison. And in response, Sarah wrote the following letter to the judge in her case. This letter contains the full, unedited version of the written statement that she gave in court, the one that she was obviously irritated that she had to pare down at the advice of her lawyers. It seemed that she either gave them the letter to review prior to the sentencing hearing, or that she actually practiced her speech with them, and they told her that there were certain elements that she obviously needed to take out if she wanted leniency, which, having reviewed the statement she gave in court, is wild to say. Sarah did such a bad job in her sentencing hearing that every single person we have seen react to it was shocked. People who had been covering the case longer than we have, who are at this point experts in Sarah Boone, could not believe the things she was saying. And that was the version that she worked on with her lawyer's help. So let's review the unedited disaster. December 6th, 2024. Mr. Michael Kranick. So we are already off to a tremendous start. If you have watched any of our coverage of Sarah Boone's letters before, then you are likely aware of how Sarah's language changes depending upon her opinion of who she is talking to. Initially, another judge was placed on this case, and when she began writing to him, she was especially reverential. The letters opened up with her calling him Honorable Judge, complimenting his ability to see through the lies of the prosecution, and stating that she knew he would be able to help her, because there was no way someone as knowledgeable as he was would be fooled by the case brought against her. In other words, she was being a kiss-ass. She wanted to get the judge on her side, so she complimented him, used unnecessarily academic language, and tried to present herself as something she wasn't, competent and smart. But over time, when the judge refused to overlook her crimes and her contempt for him grew, her language began to change. She stopped calling him honorable judge and stopped complimenting him every opportunity she had, and then began to question if he was outright orchestrating a grand conspiracy against her. She then accused him of profiting off of the court coverage, being in league with court TV and Law and Crime, and selling the video of her mocking George, even though those videos were made public due to Florida's sunshine laws. The judge was eventually replaced by Judge Michael Kranick, and the cycle started all over again. Sarah tried to get Kranick on her side through flattery and showcasing how intelligent she was. She overcomplicated every sentence she wrote in order to prove that she wasn't like the other inmates, and therefore didn't deserve to be punished for a crime she committed. And then, when that too didn't work, her language became harsher and harsher, to the point where she now even refuses to call him judge. Normally, how someone addresses a letter wouldn't be a massive deal, but Sarah's letters are actually incredibly useful when it comes to pointing out manipulation. She isn't subtle or even a skilled manipulator, so we can highlight obvious signs of manipulation, which is usually a bit more difficult to do. But moving on. I am enclosing, please, my complete statement to you and the world, as I partially read during my sentencing hearing. By reserving particular parts of my very true and meaningful statement, I was hoping to have been graced with your forgiveness, understanding, and consideration in any level or degree. For me, unfortunately, and regardless of when I had to speak on my behalf, or the number of, your ignorant mind was already made up. So pausing again real quick, because Sarah doesn't like the outcome of anything, it's automatically invalidated in her eyes. It wasn't that Judge Kranick heard her statement, found it to be condescending, and felt that it clearly demonstrated a lack of sincere remorse for the crimes she committed, then decided on the sentence. It can't be that the police and the prosecution came to the conclusion that she was responsible for George's death based on the direct, unflinching evidence. And it especially cannot be that the media reported on the case accurately, as they saw the video of her mocking George and the interrogation footage, and then came to the same conclusion. It has to be that everyone else is in the wrong. Everyone has a weird bias against her, and that for some unknown reason we want to see an innocent woman put into prison. In her mind, that is more logical than the truth. Obviously, Sarah's statement in court was awful. We cannot emphasize just how bad it was, even though what we are about to read is worse. Sarah spent most of her entire time on the stand smugly listing out every person who had wronged her in the lead up to the trial, and stating that she forgives them, even though she clearly doesn't. She is so hopelessly hung on what she feels are specific instances of disrespect that she cannot help but list out every single person she felt was responsible for why she was in prison, starting with, of course, the man she murdered. Instead of showing remorse for his death, saying she is sorry for her actions that night, and saying she wishes she can go back in time and make a different decision, she instead listed off every instance of him hurting her in order to validate her actions. But she attempted to disguise her statement as being her forgiving him, because it was important to her to insult George's memory while pretending to be contrite. She also shifted blame for any of her wrongdoings outside of the relationship onto George, insisting that he would force her to drink even though she didn't want to, because she wanted to be a more present parent, physically forcing alcohol into her mouth so she wouldn't be able to pick her son up from school, and would force her to cancel on weekends when she had custody, which is not true. Based on her previous testimony, as well as her ex-husband's account, Sarah was an alcoholic before meeting George. She was never a present parent and refused to act responsibly around their son, often leaving him alone in order to drink, even when they were married. But because so many stories of Sarah neglecting her son were told in court, she felt the need to counter them. She has to pin her wrongdoings on someone else, because actually accepting any sort of responsibility for her actions would mean that she understands that she is partially to blame, and that is simply unacceptable to her. George didn't make Sarah an unreliable parent. He didn't force her to drink herself into a stupor so often that her ex-husband would have to call her repeatedly every morning she had custody of their son to make sure she would drive him to school and pick him up. She did that herself, but she, at least publicly, cannot face that reality. The fundamental issue that Sarah has with the majority of people who look at her case is that they look at the evidence and they determine that she is responsible for George's death. In her mind, that is unreasonable and shows malice towards her. Because Judge Kranick sentenced her to life, he has an obvious bias against her for some unrelated reason and simply wants to see her suffer. Because the men and women of the jury found her guilty, they were brainwashed by the prosecution, tired and unable to see past the lies being spread about her. And because the reporting around this case has gone over how Sarah taped George begging for his life and showed that she was responsible for his death, well, of course, they're all in bed with the prosecution and only talking about her to make that money. Those boon bucks, baby. Those boon bucks. Alright, This is her brain trying to desperately rationalize why this is happening to her, without it being her fault. And to be clear, this is what she believes. She sees herself as a victim in all of this, and believes that because she stated that she never intended to kill George, that she should be released. In the lead up to the trial, we have repeatedly talked about why this defense doesn't work and why Sarah wants it to. Because if you cause a death, even if it was an accident, that is still a crime. She would still go to prison, but she disagrees. She has made it clear through her letters that she feels like a tepid, insincere apology and being a straight-A student 2 decades prior should allow her to get off with a warning. But a man is dead. That's a serious offense. Anyhow, Sarah continues, by your clear error and full-blown unfair bias against me since your involvement in my Crucible case as a whole, I have been unsuccessful in receiving anything from you as a supposed fair and neutral judge, except for your wish that I spend the rest of my life in prison. Pausing once more, so it goes without saying that this is not true. Kranick doesn't have a bias against Sarah, because that would make no sense. He didn't know who Sarah was prior to taking the case. She isn't a spurned lover. He hasn't shown a history of making unfair verdicts against middle-aged divorcees who have gone through 8 lawyers in the lead up to their trials. Kranick had to spend a long time with this case, much longer than most judges have to, and Sarah made every single step difficult. He saw her through multiple lawyers, gave her repeated warnings about her antics, stepped in and spoke to her on a number of occasions, and tried to properly explain why things were happening to her in simple enough terms for her to understand. So he was well equipped to determine her sentence. But of course, she doesn't like that. She thinks it's unfair. But she continues on. Please know and always remember, Mr. Kranick, I forgive you. Still and sincerely. Please also understand the judge, according to Cicero, is never to lose sight that he is simply a man, and that he cannot exceed the power given to him by his commission, that not only power but public confidence has been given to him, that he ought always, very seriously, to attend not to his wishes, but to the requisitions of law, justice, and religion. So, pausing again, we've covered this case for a few years, and something that is extremely clear is the amount of care that Judge Wooten, the OG represent, and Kranick put into it. Sarah is a difficult defendant, as you can see from our over 10-hour playlist of her alone, and they went through pains in order to ensure that they were giving her a fair trial. For almost 5 years, her trial continued to get delayed because of her own actions. She would routinely disparage her lawyers, purposely writing to the judges, knowing that the letters would be published in order to shame them into doing her bidding. She called them every day, even though they were working on other cases and not working full-time on her case. They told her about their time constraints, their plans moving forward, and urged her to be patient with them as they were working at the appropriate speeds. But in Sarah's mind, they worked for her, and since she didn't like the job they were doing, she was going to leave a negative review. She called each of her attorneys dumb, stated that they should be disbarred, and accused most of them of stealing her money, even though she was not the one paying them. Both judges told Sarah that they were not reading her letters, that it wasn't appropriate, and that it would hurt her working relationship with her attorneys. When the attorney eventually asked to withdraw, Sarah acted shocked, even though she had repeatedly claimed they were not equipped to handle their jobs. I say this to showcase how much patience and grace Sarah's case was treated with, how both Kranick and Wooten went above and beyond to ensure that her trial was fair, and that every decision they made was done with immense care. But now she is insisting that he has a god complex, that he has gone mad with power, and is taking out his unjust anger on her. In Sarah's world, unfortunately, everything happens to her, and nothing is her fault. Her lawyers left because they were just bad people. Her husband left because he's a bald bitch and a bad person. I don't even know if he's bald. I don't think he is. George died because he got in a suitcase. None of her actions matter, and therefore she can do whatever she wants. But there was a reason why no one in her life spoke highly of her. But more on that later, continuing on. I am excited in my appeal, which speaks for itself. My case law as well, in which I am extremely proud to have achieved, and will continue doing so now that I am no longer in your corrupt court and free from your malevolent judicial grip. Ugh. Sarah Boone versus State of Florida? I don't know. It's in all caps, I don't know why. I also have added to my statement as a result of your blindness and impartiality. Foremost, your disgust in me as being an outspoken woman, determined defendant, and proactive client, and hoping the next time you put on your listening ears, okay? And do not unfairly oppress the next, as you have so blatantly done to me. You will never admit to your many judicial errors, nor will the prosecutors theirs, and I will never admit to what you have wrongfully accused me of, and judge me as. So, pausing again. This statement right here is extremely telling, but not in the way Sarah meant for it to be. Let me explain. Sarah is condemning the judge for not seeing things her way and for being unfair towards her. She says that neither him nor the prosecution will ever admit to their faults in the case, attempting to paint them as being so concerned with their preservation of power that they are refusing to acknowledge they are capable of making mistakes. Now, the first issue with this statement is that the majority of the faults she has tried to use as evidence of bias against her is just the law. She just doesn't like how the justice system operates because it's negatively affecting her life. But besides that, she goes on to end that statement by saying she will also never admit to fault, but does so in a way where she expects to seem powerful and brave, which is a pretty blatant double standard. She is boldly stating that she is never going to admit that she caused George's death, even now after she's been convicted, even though her entire defense was that she did cause his death, and that by not admitting fault, she's being brave, somehow. She continues on. I am not a murderer. I am a survivor. Sarah Boone. Alright, so this next portion is also a part of the letter that was added after her sentencing, and was not originally included. I wanted to make that portion very clear, because when I first read the letter, I believed that this is where she originally intended to start her speech prior to being sentenced. It was only after my brother showed how the pages were lettered instead of numbered that I realized the mistake. Sarah continues. Black robe disease, arrogance in a judge, a slang term for a judge who flaunts judicial power and dominates proceeding at the expense of the dispensation of justice. Impartiality is the first duty of a judge. Before he gives an opinion or sits in judgment in a cause, he ought to be certain and absolute that he has no bias for or against either parties. If he has any interest, even the most slightest, in the cause, he is disqualified from sitting as a judge, and when aware of such interest, out to have lawfully and justly refused to sit on the case. The delicacy which characterizes the judge in this country generally forbids their sitting in such a cause. The judge must not only be impartial, but must also follow and properly enforce the law, not abuse. He is bound to declare what the law is and not make it. Be not an arbitrator, but an interpreter of the law. It is their duty to be patient in the investigation of the case, understand the circumstances and difficulties by all parties, careful in considering parts of the whole case, and decent in judgment. Beauvoir Law Dictionary. I rest my case. Quote, but at the risk of practicing judicial centrism, a word I have coined in this presentation, others have called it black robe disease. Whether he was correct or not in my behavior, it is widely accepted that judicial behavior affects the jury. Murray Richdell, The Simpson Trial, 1996. And then there is the worst of judicial ailments, the black robe disease, which is otherwise known as arrogance. Lynn Toller, A Practice Guide to Becoming an Emotional Genius, 2007. Trial judges are affirmatively charged with securing a fair trial and must intervene sua sponte to that end when necessary. Brown v. Walter. That duty encompasses not only the avoidance of error before it occurs, but the fair correction of error that may have occurred earlier in a proceeding. Carlisle v. United States. In the instant case, the trial judge did not analyze the evidence, he added to it. Dealing with the mere mannerism of the accused in giving his testimony, the judge put his own experience, with the weight that could be attached to it, in the scale against the accused. So, pausing again, we can probably all understand what Sarah is trying to imply with those extensive, repetitive, and frankly annoying quotes. I'm sorry I read them that way, but it'll probably happen again. She was implying that Judge Cranick was patently unfair towards her, that he has bias against her for some unknown reason, and that his sentence was unjustified. But the vast majority of the quotes don't actually pertain or feel relevant to the case. Her initial quote from the Bouvier Law Dictionary about the judge making sure he doesn't have any bias for or against any of the parties in the case doesn't mean that he is disallowed from having an opinion on the parties based on their actions in the lead up to the trial. It doesn't mean that he has to be a blank slate and allow any unfavorable information he heard about the defendant bounce off of him. It simply means that he cannot have his own bias towards her or the defense. Like if we found out that Cranick and Sarah had dated in the past, scandalous, that could either lead to him showing favoritism or being unfair towards her. Either way, because there is potential bias, he would have to excuse himself. That same is true with the prosecution. If it was proven that Cranick had a close relationship with the lead attorney, that too could be reason for recusal. But in Sarah's mind, Cranick looking at the facts of this case and telling her that her antics were the reason that her lawyers left was enough to demonstrate that he was simply out to get her. Sarah continues. Kinto Sukuroi is a kind of Japanese ceramic style which means to repair with gold. In this tradition, when a ceramic piece breaks, an artisan will fuse the pieces back together again using liquid gold or gold dust lacquer. So, rather than being covered up, the breaks become more obvious and a brilliant new piece of art emerges from the brokenness. It embraces flaws, weakness, and imperfections, and also teaches the essence of resilience. Every crack in a ceramic piece is a part of its history, and each piece becomes more beautiful because it's been broken. This is the wisdom of Kinto Sukuroi. Pausing again, I was made aware through the comments of our last video that this portion of Sarah's speech was taken directly from a website. I believe the YouTube channel Just a Lazy Gamer made that discovery, so I guess now we know where she got her straight A's from. She continues on. In my wisdom, and with all my repairs then, now and ongoing, God is, has been, and will always be my artisan. All of my gold is forgiveness. This has held me together, made me shine brighter and overcome the damage. From George Torres, the Torres family, the justice system, Judge fucking Wooten and Kranick. And I haven't forgot Orange County Corrections Department, social media, scoundrel detectives, infamy, defamation, ongoing constitutional rights violations, second-degree murder, forced into being pro se. But just as gold is very precious, forgiveness is invaluable. But forgiveness is not an attempt to change or forget who, what, or how you've lived through to be so gold, but an act of grace, humility, and considerable self-compassion to be set free from sorrow. Alright, so pausing again, so obviously there are two names on the list that were not on there before, that being Judge Wooten and Kranick. It seems that when Sarah had gone over her statement with her legal counsel before she was sentenced, they urged her not to directly condemn the judge who would be deciding her fate, which seems obvious. But this also adds new context as to why she was so irritable when she said that she had to edit her statement down. She was annoyed that her words have to be changed at all, even though it should go without saying that if you're trying to get a lighter sentence, which she already stated she was, that she wouldn't accuse the judge of essentially wielding his power irresponsibly. Apparently that didn't occur to Sarah at the time, and because she didn't get the sentence she wanted, she feels as if she is allowed to say and do whatever she wants now. One of the things we have found to be the most striking about Sarah is that she is piss poor at manipulation. She cannot successfully manipulate anyone, despite having spent the last decade at least trying to, and this is just another example of that. Sarah could have gone on the stand and acted contrite. She could have cried, said that she was sorry for her actions, and falsely claimed that she deeply regrets everything that happened that night. That she is sorry to the Torres family, that she understands why they would never forgive her, and that she would spend the rest of her life mourning the loss of George. Whether or not she meant the word that she was saying is irrelevant, because she wouldn't be saying it for anyone else's benefit but for her own. But she couldn't even do that. Instead, she thought out this passive-aggressive 20-plus long page letter where she blames everyone else, including the man who would be sentencing her. But continuing on, withholding forgiveness denies your brilliance, and adds even greater grief and deeper heartache. Irreparable cracks on top of the already that no one deserves, no matter the pain or disappointment, untruths or injustice. It doesn't matter, as the more broken you are, even though now different than before, you've become more outstanding and more extraordinary. Above all, when you let go of blame, misunderstanding, I lost my place, where am I? Oh, excuses, give up your anger and cease from resentment. This is forgiveness. And when you forgive, you heal. And when you heal, you move forward. Pausing once again, just to re-emphasize how inappropriate what she is saying here actually is. She is being sentenced for murder. She was tried and convicted of the murder of a man, and she is talking about how everything she has gone through, including killing George, has made her a better, more outstanding person. His family members are sitting in the courtroom, listening to her compliment herself, while she uses a warped, condescending version of forgiveness to list off her issues with everyone who has ever commented on the case, including them. She found a way to make a moment of her taking some small bit of accountability into her insulting everyone else so she could feel like she was better than them one last time. This next portion is the same as what she said previously. My gold begins with George Torres. Every time he slapped me, kicked, punched, spit on, raped, stabbed, choked, laughed at, pushed, pulled, dragged, whipped, tripped, stole from, lied, terrorized, threatened, humiliated, forced, degraded, made me cry, every time he tried to end me, defeat, or destroy. I forgive George for beating me senseless for trial to sleep because I had to go to work or my son's field trip the next day, for ruining my deceased family's heirlooms, traditions and keepsakes, my son's furniture, destroying the television we watched together, for wrecking our townhome by breaking windows, punching holes in the walls and doors, ramming his entire body into glass doors, kicking in my front and back door over and over and over, for breaking or removing locks from all the doors and sometimes the knobs altogether, so I have nowhere to feel safe, including the sacred space of my son's room where he beat me bloody on his bed, for terrorizing and threatening my blind and deaf dogs, by leaving the gate open that I built to keep them safe, telling me he hoped I'd find their bloated dead body in the pond and scrap their remains off of the pavement, for kicking them off of the bed and throwing across the room because they were trying to protect me, for threatening to make me unrecognizable to my son by breaking all the bones in my face, like his brother Moise did to him after he kept seeing all the bruises from George beating me, like all the times their father beat their mother, for all the drunken rages and fistfights with so many neighbors when wandering into their apartment during a haunting expeditions after I escaped, for drowning me in liquor and wine because I didn't want to drink, causing me to urinate on myself, then butting the end of the bottle in my face and giving me 2 black eyes and a bloody nose, for making me experience what it is to be sodomized, threatening to kill my friends and neighbors when they checked on me to make sure I was alive and in one piece, for threatening to burn down our townhome and set my car on fire because I got a job, for holding me hostage on weekends my son was supposed to come over by keeping my keys around his neck, my phone in his crotch, and a butter knife stuck in the middle of the table as a warning not to ask anything or try to leave, for stabbing me in the leg and not letting me call 911 for an ambulance to seek help, where I nearly bled to death until I concocted a lie to save him from being arrested, for destroying my phone with a hammer because my son called, for experiencing ever being arrested, and after today, prison, for beating my almost blind, crushing my occipital lobe, for having me experience what it means to see stars, like the cartoons where the character has a tall lump on their head. I had that too, many times. Dragging me downstairs by my hair in the middle of the night just to sit next to him, for taking my car and driving drunk with my debit card to buy me alcohol while I slept, even after I kindly explained the importance of my car to take my son to school foremost, me to work, and his to his batterers interventions classes and probation officer meetings, where I would be forced to sit for hours in the parking lot waiting for him. Pausing for just one moment, but if you have watched any of our previous coverage of Sarah, from her body cam footage, her interrogation, or even just her letters, how likely do you think it was that she explained something kindly, the way she says here? Because nothing she ever does or says can be described as kind. Like this letter, she would probably characterize this letter favorably, saying she is taking ownership of her actions, apologizing for the hurt that she caused, and graciously forgiving all of those who have caused her hurt in any kind. That she is taking the high road after being falsely imprisoned and being set up to fail by a flawed justice system, and giving grace to those around her who might not deserve it. But any rational person who heard her say parts of this in court, or has an ounce of basic understanding, can see why that is not what is happening here. The idea that Sarah would have ever kindly explained anything is laughable, especially in the scenario she just described. She also attempts to use her child as a shield by saying that her biggest concern was being able to take him to and from school on days when she had custody, but we've already shown how that rarely happened. Moreover, Sarah's neighbors all individually stated that she was known to drive while drunk, making the assertion that she sat George down to slowly explain why drinking under the influence was a bad decision seems far-fetched. But continuing on, for causing me so much trauma and pain mentally, physically, and emotionally that I had to be hospitalized more than once, for destroying my reputation and integrity, for my M for murder scarlet letter, not letting me feel safe to live, talk to other people, spend time with my son, have a job, friendships, simply go to the bathroom with the door closed, or go to sleep soundly and comfortably. I forgive George for lying, for him trying so many times to end me with his terrifying love. I also forgive the Torres family, his mother and father foremost, also his 2 ex-wives and daughters, all for knowing who George was, capable of and has done in his past, his history of violence and where he learned it, then to keep turning a blind eye when I would ask for help. Pausing once more. This is one of the most despicable moments we've ever seen during a case. It's up there with Joseph Zeeler, calling one of the women he killed a disgusting pig. But to bring up your deceased victim's family and air out their personal business in court is pretty horrific. However, It is notable that that has not occurred to Sarah. Again, despite her nearly 100% fail rate at manipulation, Sarah thinks that by disguising her obvious malice at the Torres family by saying she is forgiving them, that everyone will view what she is doing as being genuine and kind, that Judge Kranick will hear her blame her actions on the family members of the man she killed and be lenient with his sentencing. Her self-concept is so out of line with reality that you could not properly explain what she did wrong in the situation, even though it's obvious to everyone else. Sarah continues. All of his siblings, including Farrell Torres, who was now on his way to prison for stabbing the mother of their baby in the side of her head. For everyone who knew what George was doing to me, sometimes how and when, but allowed and enabled. I forgive them for caring a little too late. I hope they ask themselves while quiet and comfortable in bed at night an uneasy question. What could I have done to stop this from happening? To both of them. And all of the times Sarah tried to, by asking for help. From all of us, and so many times. Pausing once more, but it's also notable that earlier she claimed that one of George's brothers did step in and attacked him for hurting Sarah, that he broke all the bones in George's face after he was made aware that he laid hands on her. So the idea that they did nothing is either untrue or that didn't even happen. Moreover, Sarah and George were adults. Sarah had asked the Torres family for help, and they encouraged the couple to break up. They didn't like them together, and they repeatedly said that they brought out the worst in each other, and whenever the pair would break up or the police would become involved in their domestic disputes, they would both make the choice to get back together, which makes blaming his family nonsensical. What were they supposed to do beyond simply encouraging them not to be together? They couldn't make them break up because they're adults. Telling the family of the deceased that they didn't do enough, that they should have tried harder to get George to leave her, places the responsibility solely on them. This is a truly demented thing to say to anyone whose family member died, especially by the person who killed them. But Sarah once again continues. Another great contributor of my gold is social media with its greed, insensitivity, deception, obvious exploitation, and advantageous gain of my criminal case as a whole, and for sentencing me by anticipation as a result of ignorance and hate conjured and fabricated by the organized crime that is social media, which condemned me in the court of global public opinion since the beginning. My family law case is the new prey, waiting to be picked apart and pillaged from me being made infamous by social media in my criminal case. It simply seems I cannot forgive and be forgiven and just move forward. Social media has made me a pariah. It has caused great oppression and undeniable disadvantages, especially by broadcasting and manipulating my cases online. In my criminal case, as a result, my opportunities to be given a fair, proper, and uninfluenced, successful conclusion was heavily depleted and poisoned. But I forgive them. Also the media tycoons for not having a life of their own, trying so desperately to make themselves seem so right, by making me appear so wrong. Forgiveness for prejudgment, ridiculous theatrics, lies, making and taking blood money from my misfortunes, accidents and catastrophes. It's all over their hands and their keyboards. Pausing once again, this is almost a coherent point, because there is a good amount to be said about social media and how people view true crime through its lens. We've discussed the topic during our exploration of the Delphi murder case, which we are working on remaking due to its tremendous updates, and due to the fact that the case was wildly mismanaged. But that is not what happened in this case. Sarah's case was notable because the very concept of someone being killed via suitcase is eye-catching. Add to the fact that the case occurred in Florida, the state with the most robust sunshine laws in the US, and therefore all the body cam footage was made public, and it immediately drew the public's attention. And while some people absolutely reported on the case as if Sarah was guilty from day one, it's because the agreed upon facts of the case made that point clear. Sarah's argument in court was never, my actions didn't lead to George's death, but I didn't mean to cause George's death. Though she tries to deny any and all responsibility now, by zipping up the suitcase and leaving him in it overnight, she killed George. There is no denying that. As far as I have been able to find in our years of researching this case, there's no evidence that large channels made up their own theories and narratives about what happened. The police and experts gave their opinions based on the evidence, but most reports have been concise and to the point, merely pointing out her refusal to accept the direct evidence against her as being strange. Again, everything is everyone else's fault. If the public looked at the case details and didn't agree that she was in the right, it was because the reports were biased. But she continues. And even after all that's been said and done, theorized, hypothesized, scrutinized, and blasphemed in my case, still, no one knows me. Pausing again real quick. No one needs to know Sarah in order to pass judgment on this case. Also, no one needs to personally know any criminal or person in real life to pass a judgment on them at all. But she continues. My gold also runs deep for my prior attorneys, Mauricio Padilla, who sold me the world with empty promises, then abandoned his responsibilities as my attorney after taking 2.5 years of my life when finally realizing he was in over his head, all while hoarding JAC dollars to fund his staycations with his family when in town from Miami, for having resources ready and available, not allowing me, the client, to ever utilize, which could have greatly professed my case and perhaps concluded, only for him to decide water parks, fine dining, and choice hotels were more important, and on the JAC's dime. Pausing once more, but Sarah has a massive issue with how she perceives other people's work, and this is a problem, because there's no reasoning with someone who acts like this. If you recall, Sarah's issue with her attorney was and always has been that she cannot see what they are doing at all times, that they aren't working alongside her, and that they aren't providing her with updates on what they are doing on her case. In her mind, if she cannot see what her lawyers are doing, if she is not given daily updates on the status of her case, if they've been able to find expert witnesses and so on, she thinks that they are disrespecting her and not doing their job. She felt that she needed to be involved in the creation of their defense, that her opinion and perspective was necessary, and that when her lawyers told her that they would be doing the majority of the heavy lifting, they were actually trying to screw her over. She wanted to be treated not as a client, but as co-counsel, even though every time she put forward a potential argument, it was nonsense. Moreover, because Sarah was in jail in the lead up to her trial, she could not actually help them. They needed to contact and re-interview witnesses, talk to experts, do research into relevant case law, all of which took hours of time and energy that she could not see. Because she couldn't see it, she felt like it wasn't really happening. Because her lawyers didn't schedule a daily call with her or give her a rundown of everything they did that day, like a child would have to do with their parents, she openly accused them of trying to sabotage her case via her letters. Most of her lawyers were public attorneys, working at their cases, and told Sarah as much. They informed her that she would be involved as much as they could allow, but they wouldn't be available for daily calls or weekly meetings and the like, which was unacceptable to her. She is now accusing Mr. Padilla of stealing money, even though that was money he earned. He was rendering a service to her, but because she didn't witness that service, she feels like it doesn't exist. She also seems to think that you are only required to pay a lawyer if they make it to court, as if all the work they do before, that should be pro bono. A trial is basically like the World Series of court. The entire lead-up is filled with lawyers working tirelessly behind the scenes, but because Sarah didn't physically see it, she doesn't think it actually happened. Mauricio didn't steal resources in order to fund a lavish lifestyle. He has a high-paying job and was able to use the money he earned working for Sarah and other clients to have a nice life. What he does with his money is entirely his business. Sarah hasn't spoken to Mr. Padilla in years, as he was her first attorney back in 2020. But despite trying to frame this statement as her forgiving him for some perceived wrongdoing, all she has shown is that she's been holding on to her anger towards him for years, that she viewed him leaving her case as an act of malice, one that deserves an apology and a prison sentence. To be clear, she is accusing him of defrauding the state by pretending to have worked for Sarah. She is saying he should be disbarred, all for withdrawing his counsel, and she's angry that she was told by her current counsel that she couldn't say this on the stand if she wanted to try and get a lesser sentence. But she continues, I forgive Frank J. Bankowitz for committing perjury to the judge and on court record about my attempts to be a proactive defendant and client, then inquiring about my discovery, then trying to communicate with no answers or correspondence in any manner for 1 full year and 2 months, before I was able to finally meet with him in the courtroom, only to receive his motion to withdraw. Frank J. Bankowitz is forgiven for his greed in taking $15,000 from the JAC, who honorably aid indignant defendants as myself, for taking advantage of and robbing the justice system by lying and avoiding clients, taking their money and the JAC's. Winston E. Hobson receives my forgiveness, who also unethically perjured himself to the judge and on court record about all the progress and attorney work he did on my case for the 2 months he was court appointed as, for his allegations of my supposed unethical requests, which meant me asking for my discovery and trying to have him file a motion for my lawful inclusion to my pre-trial conferences cited under FRCP Discovery Rule 3.2.20. I wanted to be included in my case and know the progress from being excluded by Bankowitz and Padilla over 3 years prior. Oh, forgiveness. Also when telling me he would return in a week with my discovery, only to receive his motion to withdraw in the meantime. Still not receiving my discovery, and I filing my own motion, enabling me to go to all my hearings, including my pretrials. continued forgiveness in his greed and selfish intentions, also for robbing the JAC and indignant defendants of $15,000 more for nothing, justifying any work he really did do in the handful of days he represented me as my attorney. Finally, and with all my gold received from this one, I forgive Patricia A. Cashman for her mean, snotty, egotistical attitude and not listening or caring that I finally received my discovery I kept asking for, which she fully withheld from me, citing her ridiculous, untrue reasons, was because I saw my first attorney 4 years prior, and while she was being my present, at that time attorney, I saw not one page or any digital evidence from my discovery she prohibited me from seeing. Patricia A. Cashman is also forgiven for admitting I had a right to bond I asked her for. I could actually utilize one of my rights as opposed to having them always violated as prior and still ongoing. Then her deterrence of all my opportunities to do so. For all of her lies, condescension, gross unnecessary arguments, and anger that I asked any questions and wanted to understand. For her doing nothing other than giving me an even harder time and request transcripts. Then brazenly lie for over $16,000 for doing so, also from the precious resources provided from the JAC. I forgive Patricia A. Cashman for being a liar and a bully. So, pausing again, none of these lawyers needed Sarah's forgiveness because they did nothing wrong. These lawyers did not perjure themselves, nor did they blatantly ignore Sarah. They simply did their jobs and tried to communicate that to Sarah. But because they detailed their poor experiences working alongside her in court, she has to admonish them. Because they said she was hard to work with, they have to be evil. It's that simple. There are court minutes from when Bankowitz filed his motion to withdraw as Sarah's counsel that properly demonstrate her state of mind. This was after Sarah had written multiple letters, claiming that Frank was purposely ignoring her, that he was an idiot, and that she had called him multiple times a day for case updates, even though he was actively working on other cases and informed her he wouldn't be able to help her. During the hearing, Sarah was asked a series of questions about Bankowitz and stated she liked working with him and didn't understand why he no longer wanted to be on the case. She said she felt like he was perfectly equipped to be her attorney and that she didn't want him to quit. However, later on, when asked about the complaints she had listed in her letters, she changed her mind, saying that he was an idiot who didn't know anything about being a lawyer and should be disbarred. Sarah will say whatever she believes will benefit her at the time, even if that means actively lying and accusing someone else of a crime and threatening their livelihood. It doesn't matter to her. But none of these attorneys did anything wrong. Sarah continues, forgiveness for all of those who did not include me to receive my $15,000 share I worked for when Judge Kranick forced me to be my own attorney, to represent myself pro se. I actually and finally got my own discovery almost 5 years later. Filed motions all prior should have done, making them the most expensive motions ever, at over $46,000 between the 3 prior attorneys, Frank J. Bankowitz, Walter E. Hobson, Patricia A. Cashman. Would they have done so when supposedly representing me? The motions would have been priceless for the proper use of the JAC funds towards ethics, professionalism, honest, and freedom. I honorably utilized my JAC resources and mentorship as a proactive, indignant defendant, avidly defending myself against the liars, thieves, and real villains in my criminal case. So who really is the criminal? The JAC can hopefully include their forgiveness for them also. Pausing again, that's a pretty sick mic drop from Sarah, but she believes that any person who represents themselves pro se should also be paid by the state, that she deserved nearly $50,000 for the work she did over the short period of time she acted as her lawyer. But that's not how anything works. She isn't a lawyer. She isn't rendering a service to the state by representing herself. She's representing herself because she has proven that she cannot work alongside anyone who doesn't immediately buckle to her every whim. A public defender is paid by the state because they are working for the state on Sarah's behalf. Sarah could not hire her own attorney, but was owed a fair trial, like every citizen, and was provided one. She then forfeited that right due to her own actions. The state, therefore, does not need to pay her because she is not working for them. She's working for herself. But again, Sarah's ego is on full display here, because someone else, someone she views as beneath her, was paid for a job she feels like she can do better. She thinks she is owed financial compensation. She feels like she is owed a world-changing amount of money, even though if you read through any of the motions that she filed on her own behalf, they are nonsense. But the letter is about to get so much worse. Continuing on. Judge Wooten and Cranick, I have great forgiveness for also, in not protecting me and listening to my valid requests for judicial intervention so I could properly and fairly defend myself against my charges. Instead, I had to defend myself against the attorneys appointed by the judge and court, against their lies and exaggerations. Reasons unjustifiable why they were creeping away from the battlefield and abandoning their professional duty as my attorney. Pausing once more, the remainder of Sarah's life was in Judge Cranick's hands. She could have walked away, pled guilty to the manslaughter charge that had been offered to her, and been out of prison in about 13 years, but she said no. She thought she had a surefire case and was set to win, and then when that didn't happen, she decided that the best course of action directly before being sentenced for second-degree murder was to publicly reprimand the judge who would be deciding her fate. Say what you will about this case, but Judge Cranick was incredibly fair and thorough with Sarah. He warned her 6 lawyers in that if she could not keep a lawyer, he would force her to go pro se. He set a date for the trial and told her that he wouldn't be moving it, even if she lost her attorneys and would be forced to represent herself, and he kept to that. He repeatedly asked Sarah in the lead up to her trial and in the trial itself if she was satisfied with her representation, and he went out of his way to ensure that everything was done by the books. But because he didn't agree with her that she was being unfairly penalized, she has decided he is a terrible judge. But Sarah continues, Judge Cranick, I forgive you for not giving me any opportunity to stand at your pulpit, to stand at all, to explain the real, truthful side of the story. Okay, pausing again, but she did tell her side of the story multiple times over. She said what happened the morning of. She said what happened the following day. She said what happened in each of her letters. She said what happened when she took the stand in her pretrial letters. She said what happened when she testified on her own behalf. She said what happened when she took the stand at her sentencing, and she is saying what happened right now. But since that didn't yield the results she wanted, she instead pretends she isn't allowed to speak, that she's been silenced the whole time. Judge Cranick not only provided times for Sarah to share her side of the story, but she created opportunities for herself. The issue is that her story doesn't matter. Sarah was objectively abused. The relationship was exceedingly violent, but that still doesn't justify what Sarah did here. Sarah goes on, I believe if the justice system, including yourself, would and should be done any vital homework on the already almost see-through attorneys from being spread so thin and simply sending an email to care about their present workload, number of clients, trial schedules that are already in place before throwing another inmate defendant unknowing client on the heaping, unimportant pile of warm bodies, more taxpayer dollars could be conserved and less time consumed and wasted for everyone, regardless of what part they pay in the supposed justice system. Pausing once more, are public defenders overworked? Absolutely. But Sarah doesn't really care about that. We know this because when they tried to explain to her they cannot answer every single one of her calls because of that fact, she felt like they weren't taking her feelings seriously and told her friends to harass the attorneys as well. It's also clear that she doesn't care about wasting taxpayer dollars, as she's been doing that for years. Sarah continues on. My forgiveness is deepened for taking even greater time of mine away. Years. By not caring to ask me anything about anything to understand so you could justly render your life-defining judgments and withhold any more bias and prejudice. Foremost, Judge Cranick, I forgive you for kicking me when I was done and choking the life out of my constitutional amendments. Most profoundly my 6th, right to counsel as a result of my wholehearted use of my 1st, right to free speech and being my own advocate since no one else would be and received a paycheck for, and all my free speech, experience-driven letters only for remedy, and any collaboration inclusion, receiving me discovery as an inmate, defendant, and client, not removal of any attorneys to cause more delays or any reason or excuse you try to make to force on me, and have already inappropriately accused me of doing prior to your heavily insinuated strategies of mine, quote unquote, to try and deflect the glaring red flags, disappointments in true crime in and of the justice system. Okay, so pausing once more. When Cranick was first assigned to the case, he made a declarative statement that he wouldn't allow Sarah to continue to waste the court's time by switching attorneys. He noted that Judge Wooten had already allowed multiple of Sarah's attorneys to withdraw, and when he told her this, he implied that she was purposely changing lawyers as a part of a strategy to put forward the motion that she was denied her right to a swift trial. And while one could argue that, in my opinion, Sarah has shown that she doesn't think that far into the future. You can't really presuppose logic onto her. because she's not that clever. In response, every letter she has written since has addressed this allegation, because she felt like he was disrespecting her. To her, that displays that he was biased against her, and should have been removed from the case entirely. Sarah continues, "To this day and all forward, I do not forfeit my rights, any of them ever, especially my right to be bold, outspoken, and write in my real-life experiences with the legal and justice systems. You weren't there, Judge Kranick, in anything. No meetings, phone calls, visits, and still took my rights and oppressed harder. I now defend myself against you, praying you do not care to late as all the others, and retaliate further against me as a proud citizen of the United States of my America, and freely, excitedly using my God-given rights to still try and defend myself, to stand all the way up for you to remove my freedom altogether by allowing and approving my stab wound, bloody body parts, rapes, bumps, bruises, and all the rest of the beatings I endured. I hope you can finally see and understand just some of the pain from the extreme difficulties, obstacles, and unfairnesses, especially in my due process, you have added in my criminal case and life as an inmate, defendant, and client. All is forgiven. For detectives Copsel and Lowen, I forgive their demonization, lies, blacklisting, coercion, law-breaking, solicitation of my case before I even arrived at the corrections department to be booked and fingerprinted. This can be seen in my unbeknownst interrogation video where I ask what they are doing, what all the pinging was during their texting swarm, while I naively sat there waiting to be arrested, which they knew was going to happen the day before. For Copsel, for bold-faced lying on the stand to the judge, and the court on record she didn't tell me to come to the station to pick up my phone. Where else would I go? I didn't even know about the surprise interrogation. Pausing once more, if I could ask Sarah one question, it would be, what does she think everyone else's motive for lying about her is? Here she is claiming that the lead investigators decided to unfairly pin the blame for George's death on her, even though there is clear evidence against her. Yet, she never explains why. She has said that there's a government-wide conspiracy against her, and at this point, there are thousands of people involved. The police, the prosecution, the attorney general, and every person who's been made aware of this case and believed her to be guilty is probably involved. But what makes her so important for everyone to conspire against her? Did she know government secrets? Did she witness an assassination? Her case has no legs to begin with, but this is where it truly falls apart, because as far as we have seen, she's just some lady with an alcohol problem. But back to the letter. I forgive them for also lying how the news showed up to record my walk of shame, handcuffed and confused on camera. I forgive them for trying to make me lose from the beginning by starting the unquenchable wildfire of sensationalism and distortion, ignorant defamation and greed, by unlawfully broadcasting who they wanted the world to think I was by their schemes, their learned lessons and fraudulent stratagems from the school of manipulation and taking advantage. How much did they make off of me, and are still calling it in, then removing the curtain to expose their personally twisted, murdering monster? Also, my forgiveness and greater gold comes from wondering why nothing viable in my defense was taken from my townhome, aka the crime scene. To aid in my truth, such as the butcher knife, 5-prong garden claw, or hammer under the table together outside where George had easy access to if I tried to leave or call for help while being held against my will during his rageful binges, or my bloody pillowcase stained from being backhanded because I hid the magnum-sized bottle of vodka from him. Why weren't any crime scene photos taken from the holes patched in the walls or doors? Some doors, missing knobs, and all locks George removed, cracked windows, broken furniture, obvious unnatural destruction in my fucking townhome. And how were those missed, uncared about, or not questions so I could explain some of my terror? It makes no difference. All is forgiven. Pausing once more, I can easily explain why those things were not taken into evidence. It's because they weren't considered evidence. Again, when the police came to the townhome, they were processing a scene of a man who had died in a suitcase and had multiple blunt force injuries to his body. They were not looking for evidence of previous abuse, and did not become aware of that fact until after the scene had been processed. Moreover, we know that George did abuse Sarah. That has never been questioned earnestly in court. There are multiple documented instances of George abusing Sarah in the home, in front of others, and police reports were shown in court. Having a knife brought in or photos of the walls would not have made those reports any more real. Sarah continues, Prosecutors Mr. J and Mr. Cassiatori, my forgiveness is also extended for your inappropriate attributed motives, for having to go through years of my pictures, videos, texts to erroneously piece together your deceitful, damning version of when really happened and who I am. After so much availability and for so long, you were finally able to make the circle fit into the square. Pausing real quick. I mentioned in our video going over her time on the stand that Sarah viewed the prosecution as being the lead malevolent force in her life, that they were the cause of all of her issues, which is why she was unable to agree with them at any point during the trial, and I think this next bit absolutely proves that. Sarah continues, I forgive your antics, theatricals, ludicrous comments to make sure the world got their money's worth while watching with ignorant pitchforks and burning torches, hoping for the best from you, which is my worst. Instead of, quote, dropping the mic, Mr. J, you dropped the hat for yelling, finger-pointing, and intense underlining to force your theatricals and fantastic onto the jury by using imaginary space adventures and fictional characters to blind and bedazzle them with your far, far away from the truth dramatizations. Pausing real quick, so the prosecution used a metaphor during one of their statements, and even though Sarah is a huge fan of that narrative device, she feels like it was unfair. Prosecution used one metaphor, one time, and she thinks that that confounded and hoodwinked the jury, as if they were little babies. But Sarah, of course, continues. In all of your pieced-together productions, I forgive you the most for never seeing the light in people, their human goodness, humor, and big hearts. You wake up and see the opposite, to condemn and take lives in your own way. See the good that does exist in all of us, inherently and unforced, even as the proud Mr. J stated, the kicked dog that bites. Mr. J, who kicked the fucking dog in the first place? In my wisdom, it's usually best to leave sleeping dogs lie. Then they don't bite. My gold also goes out to the jury for not understanding my cracks, from being blinded by the injustice and malpractice and all the judicial and prosecutorial errors, the very apparent violations of my constitutional rights during my case, an entire trial, which caused mass confusion and dysfunction. Stopping again, this portion was taken out because directly insulting the jury of men and women who unanimously found her guilty is such a monumentally bad move. Instead of just accepting that they saw the evidence against her, heard both sides' arguments, and sided with the prosecution, she had to state that they were just too stupid to understand what was actually going on, that they didn't understand the points she was trying to make, and that's why they made the wrong decision. She was just too smart for the jury, and now she is spending the rest of her life in prison, which is just fundamentally wrong. There is no other way to say it. At every possible instance, Sarah has been told that she is in the wrong, and that every single instinct that she has is bad, and will only lead to more negative outcomes. And instead of having any bit of self-awareness that may be that she is the problem, she just still blames everyone else. The letter continues. I forgive the jury, truly, for being wary from this confusion and dysfunction, also from being hungry and tired and wanting to go home to their families after being away from them in full capacity for 2 weeks. I understand. From this, their brash, misguided, corrupted decisions, I was wrongfully judged a murderer and instead of a survivor, but for this, all is forgiven. For this, I can survive and stand tall, having an even greater, the greatest opportunity to fully be understood in the Supreme Court for my appeal. I didn't lose. God just wanted me to win in a different way. Freedom is forgiveness. Heart emoticon. In the end, I forgive myself for not choosing my life sooner, for not being more brave, vigilant, bolder, and outspoken. Stronger mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. For being hopeless, desperate, simple-minded, weak, and inexperienced. I forgive myself for not realizing I was enduring a life of domestic violence, and that the vicious cycle of never ends. I had nothing to compare to. I've never been hit by a man before in my life. I was raised that hitting a woman was wrong, and should never happen. No excuse. I forgive myself for not escaping permanently, for not fighting back sooner to save myself, my son, my dogs, my home, and car. Having 20/20 hindsight, thinking of everything I could have done differently or better to avoid the outcome. I think about this every day since. Also, all of the good days we had together, for him at least, while I was constantly in hyperdrive, high alert, and paranoid, making sure I did everything right all the time. I knew if not, the great possibility I would be ended as George threatened me with so many times before. I forgive myself for falling in love with a monster, and no matter how grotesque he may have become, I still loved, hoped, and forgave. I tried breaking the spell so he wouldn't be a monster anymore. I saw who he was inside. George made me then, now, and always love him, for all of his cracks also. We made each other our own brilliant pieces of art, from the cracks and repair. Unfortunately, not all cracks can be. In all my forgiveness, George is my greatest lesson, and will forever be a part of me. I think of him every day and speak to him when alone in the rec yard. I ask his forgiveness, and that he looks for me at the gates of heaven, so I can tell him just how sorry I am, endlessly, and that I never stopped loving him, in all of it, and still. When I first came to jail, I put my mat under my bed and cried all day and night for months, only falling asleep from being so exhausted with grief. I wrote him letters. I wrote his family and his daughters apologizing and asking for their forgiveness. But due to fear that my life or son's would be jeopardized, I did not send. I am sorry. I cannot begin to fathom any of their grief and sadness. Forgive me. Pausing again, that last part is more in line with where her entire statement should have been, although she still takes the time to try and state that George's entire family is a dangerous bunch of criminals who wanted her dead. Had she talked about her mourning of George, her regret over her actions that night, and how she is sorry for what she has done, this statement would have been more successful. But there is something else that is notable about this, which I feel could almost pass under the radar, and that's the fact that Sarah says "forgive me" at the end, instead of "I'm sorry." An apology is a plea to the other person to understand your remorse. You feel badly for something, and you want them to know that you feel badly for it. And there is an understanding that sometimes apologies are not enough to remedy the hurt you've caused, especially if you are apologizing for killing someone. But Sarah doesn't say that she's sorry. She doesn't apologize in a way that shows humility or understanding of what she has done wrong. She simply demands forgiveness, and emphasizes that forgiveness should be given because she felt bad nearly 5 years ago. She doesn't want to show growth. She doesn't want to earn forgiveness through her actions. She wants to be forgiven because she doesn't like feeling bad. If you've ever had an argument with someone who refuses to say that they are sorry and simply demands that you move on from the issue, then you know how frankly rude this kind of response is. It's someone ignoring the hurt and injury they have caused and making the other person feel bad for wanting an apology in the first place. It's them trying to make you, the aggrieved party, feel crazy for holding on to hurt and acting as if it's an affront to them. But in this case, it's especially ridiculous given that she is demanding that George's family, the people that she publicly shamed, should be forgiving her and moving on. Sarah continues, "Almost everything reminds me of him, seeing my stab wound, every day especially. Oh, it truly reminds me of all I did live through. George haunts me. He is everywhere. I believe because I do still love him, think of him, and miss his laugh the most. In my heart, I know he is with me and understands that this tragedy was not intentional. I hope everyone can. His family foremost. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please wholeheartedly know that, and always. Forgive me, George. Forgive me, Torres family. Forgive me, Judge Kranick. To the entire planet, forgive me." I graciously and humbly ask for consideration for forgiveness to be extended instead of judgment, for reconciliation and restoration for all of us, to move forward. Alright, pausing once more. Again, I don't know what Sarah expected the sentence to be. It seems that she thought there was a genuine chance that Judge Kranick would give her probation, that since she demanded to be forgiven, she could just move forward, that they would agree that this was the rational thing to do. But a man is dead. Her actions directly led to his death. There has to be some form of punishment for that. She continues, "My apology is profuse and ceaseless." Okay, pausing again, no it wasn't. It totally wasn't. I have unfortunately read every single letter Sarah has written. I don't know fucking why, but I have read them. And every one of her arguments, every filing, everything. She has not apologized one time. Even her last statement isn't an apology, it's a demand. Forgive me. I feel bad because I did something wrong, and therefore continuing to make me feel bad is mean. It's ridiculous. But she continues, "Allow me please to brush off the muck, wipe the blood off of my face, and fix the cuts in my skin. I ask for understanding in what really happened and for how long, for second chances, repentance, and redemption to advocate for all domestic violence survivors, to help them overcome, heal, and still hope always, to make their voices heard, to confidently walk with their scars on the outside and inside, to help them not ever become a casualty of domestic violence as so many others, to stop the abuse and maltreatment before it's too late. There is always hope. You can survive. In my soft-spoken conclusion, I ask this. Would I be the darling mother, celebrated woman of the year, if it were I who died? How many daughters, mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, nieces, and friends have been because they did? I am a survivor. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rebuke the oppressor. Defend the fatherless. Plead for the widow. Isaiah 117. All-encompassing, protect the abused, Sarah Boone. So that was the entire document, which Sarah believed would lead to Judge Cranick deciding to give her a lighter sentence. She thought that if she got on the stand and read that out, accused him of being in a collective that set her up to take the fall for a crime she did not commit, he would sentence her to probation, or maybe a couple of years in prison. That is pretty shocking to say the least, even for her. This statement is objectively worse than the one she gave in court, but that one is still horrible. Sarah believed that this statement would lead to her release, that Cranick and the general public would feel rightfully shamed for what they had done to her, but that obviously was not the case, and still isn't. I expect that we will hear from Sarah soon, but I didn't expect the full letter, showing her original statement, and I sincerely hope that this is the last time we hear from her for a while. At least. So with that said, let me know what you thought of this video in the comments down below. If there was a video you would like to see on the channel, or a case you want to bring more attention to, let me know by emailing me at dreading.official@gmail.com. We're consistently going through our emails and adding cases to our list of stories to research. Remember, stay safe. You know what? Stay frosty. How about that, huh? What does the algorithm think of that? Really amp this fucking video up, take it to the next level.